What if, in 1944, the USSR had a tank capable of taking on tigers on equal terms from any distance? A machine with 120 millimeters of frontal armor, fast, agile, and secret. It was built, it was adopted for service, it was combat-ready, and it was hidden, deliberately, forever. This is not a story about a weapon of war, but about a weapon that was never allowed to go to war. Why did Stalin and his generals reject this panther killer at the height of their offensive? Why did they hide its very existence from their own soldiers, dooming tank crews to die in outdated T-34s? In this investigation, you will learn how genius designer Alexander Morozov defied the laws of physics to create an impossible tank, why the first production models were of such appalling quality that even the military's own inspectors refused to accept them, the shocking truth about the chaos at the secret Kharkov plant, where theft of parts and drunkenness were swept under the rug, and the main paradox, how this very failure, this shameful disaster, led the USSR to create the most mass-produced and fearsome tank in world history, the legendary T-44. This isn't just a story about steel. It's a story of how military necessity, betrayal, bureaucracy, and human error ground the war's most promising project into scrap metal. Why was it buried, and what came of it? Watch till the end. The answer will shock you.
1943, the Eastern Front. After devastating defeats, the Germans made a serious bet on the qualitative superiority of their armored forces. Tigers and Panthers, next-generation machines designed for one purpose, undisputed dominance at long range, appeared en masse on the battlefield. Their long-barreled guns and powerful armor overturned previous notions of tank warfare. For T-34 crews, used to relying on speed, maneuverability, and sloped armor, a dark period began. The Wehrmacht's steel giants struck Soviet tanks from distances of 1.5 to 2 kilometers, remaining virtually invulnerable to return fire. To get within their own effective combat range, Soviet tankers had to cross hundreds of meters of open ground under murderous fire, and many failed. Burning T-34s became a terrible and all too common sight in the summer battles. The Soviet tank industry faced a task on which the outcome of the entire war depended. They needed immediately to create a new medium tank capable of fighting the best German machines on equal terms. Not just a modernized T-34 with a new turret or gun, but a fundamentally different combat vehicle. The technical requirements sounded like a challenge to the laws of physics: achieve a qualitative leap in protection by radically increasing frontal armor thickness, yet stay within the weight limit of an existing medium tank to preserve its key advantages: mobility, operational deployment, and chassis reliability. This nearly impossible mission was entrusted to the man who knew the 34's weaknesses best: Chief Designer Alexander Alexandrovich Morozov. He was one of the creators of the legendary machine. Now he had to surpass it. Morozov understood that cosmetic improvements wouldn't save the situation. A breakthrough, a new architecture for the entire tank was needed. And a brilliant solution was found. It lay in a simple but bold rearrangement. Morozov proposed abandoning the classic longitudinal layout where the engine and transmission were positioned lengthwise, taking up much space. Instead, he turned the powertrain sideways. This revolutionary decision for its time became the key to all subsequent success.
The transverse engine placement drastically shortened the length of the engine and transmission compartment. The gained tens of centimeters of precious internal volume were immediately used to enhance protection. The freed-up space allowed the turret to be moved toward the center of the hull, improving weight distribution, and most importantly, to increase frontal armor to an unprecedented 120 millimeters for a medium tank. Thus, on the drawing boards at the Ural-Vaganzad Design Bureau in Nizhny Tagil, a tank designated the T-44 began to take shape. On paper, it promised to be the very tiger killer, invulnerable, fast, and dangerous. But between a bold blueprint and a mass-produced combat vehicle lay a chasm. Now the engineers had to fill this new layout with specific, reliable components and prove that theoretical calculations could become the harsh reality of war. The new layout was merely the skeleton of the future tank. To bring this concept to life, practically every system of the vehicle had to be rethought. The transverse placement of the 520 horsepower V-44 engine required the creation of a fundamentally new gearbox and final drives to effectively transmit power to the tracks. This was a complex engineering unit, but it was what kept the power compartment compact. The gain in length was so significant that the designers could not only strengthen the armor, but also make the hull lower, reducing the tank's overall silhouette and making it a more difficult target for enemy gunners. Another revolutionary decision was the complete abandonment of the famous Christie suspension, a hallmark of Soviet tanks from the BT to the T-34. It was replaced by torsion bar suspension. Instead of bulky vertical springs, elastic steel bars, torsion bars, were now housed inside the hull. This freed up enormous space inside the fighting compartment. The crew gained more room to work, and crucially, significant reserve space appeared for ammunition storage, increased to 58 rounds. The machine itself became more stable on the move, and its ergonomics improved incomparably. The T-44's new turret, though retaining the familiar 85mm caliber of the ZIS S-53 gun, was completely redesigned. It received a streamlined, near-hemispherical shape, which not only increased the chance of enemy shell ricochets, but was also more technologically advanced to produce. The turret shifted toward the tank's center of gravity, improving accuracy while moving. Combined with the hull's frontal armor, now thickened to 120 millimeters, these solutions created a level of protection previously unavailable to medium tanks. Despite the increased protection, the T-44 did not become a slowpoke. The new powertrain and efficient transmission gave it a top speed of 51 kilometers per hour on roads. The machine remained mobile and agile, preserving the tactical advantage of Soviet tank forces. Thus, on testing grounds, the T-44 demonstrated a phenomenal combination of firepower, protection, and mobility. It seemed the perfect answer to the Tigers had been found, and all that remained was to launch mass production. However, this is precisely where the real drama began. The brilliant prototype, born in the workshops of the modern Ural Vagon Zavod, collided with the harsh reality of war-ravaged industry. Its fate would be decided not on proving grounds, but in the half-destroyed workshops of another plant where chaos and desperation reigned. But the war dictated its own terms. Mass production of the promising machine required enormous industrial capacity, and none was free. All the giants of tank production, Ural-Vagon Zavod, CKZ, Plant Number 174, were loaded to capacity producing the proven T-34-85. The only enterprise that could theoretically master the T-44 was the recently liberated Kharkov Plant Number 75. This decision, made at the top, became fateful. It seemed like a logical logistical move to return production to the historic cradle of Soviet tanks, but in practice, it turned into an engineering nightmare. Plant number 75 in 1944 was a sorry sight. What the Germans hadn't managed to take during their retreat had been methodically destroyed or looted. Workshops stood with broken windows and damaged roofs. Some equipment had been taken to Germany, and the remaining machine tools were often unfit for precision engineering. But that wasn't even the main problem. The skilled personnel, the backbone of the pre-war plant, were scattered, evacuated to the Urals and Siberia. Some died at the front. Some disappeared during the occupation. New staff had to be recruited literally from the streets, from among the residents returning to the destroyed city, lacking experience or specialized skills. It was under these conditions, driven by enthusiasm and orders from above, that the workers accomplished the seemingly impossible. By December 1944, overcoming shortages of everything, from blueprints to measuring tools, they assembled the first 5 T-44 tanks. It was a feat of labor. But when military inspectors, led by Colonel General Korobkov, began checking, enthusiasm turned to shock. The machines were not just raw, they were essentially inoperable. Each machine was a unique product, assembled with gross deviations from the blueprints. Armor plates supplied by the Mariupol plant varied in thickness and geometry. Hulls were assembled from scraps instead of whole sheets. The very design scheme was violated. General Korobkov was merciless in his harsh report to People's Commissar Malyshev. He stated, the plant lacked equipment, lacked the necessary tooling and instruments for quality control, and the military inspectors simply had nothing to check the quality with. His verdict was severe. Accept these tanks only as training combat vehicles, completely unsuitable for dispatch to the front, and immediately halt acceptance until systemic problems were resolved. Production started with such difficulty, hit a wall of post-war devastation, low production standards, and organizational chaos. The plant faced not just producing tanks, but learning how to make them all over again. And this battle for quality proved more terrifying than any fight with tigers. After the shocking verdict of the military inspectors, a new war began for the Kharkov plant, an invisible war with itself. The diagnosis delivered by the plant director in March 1945 was ruthless. The cause of the failure lay not only in the devastation, but also in the human factor. Workshops were mired in makeshift methods and a lack of control. High-performance machine tools stood idle, while parts continued to be made manually on outdated equipment, creating monstrous inconsistency. Blueprints existed only formally, technological process sheets ignored. There wasn't even elementary accounting for materials. Parts were lost by the ton, and defects were easily concealed. Discipline was at zero, and norms weren't fulfilled due to endless downtime and poor organization. Realizing the plant couldn't pull itself out alone, People's Commissar of the tank industry, Vyacheslav Malyshev, took drastic measures. An authoritative commission from Moscow, a group of highly experienced specialists who had gone through the school of evacuation and setting up production under inhuman conditions, was urgently sent to the enterprise. Their task was not to advise, but to command and restore order. They started with a total audit of every workshop, every machine tool, every operation. Their methods were tough, almost military. Strict, multi-level control was established. A special operative bureau was organized within the Technical Control Department, meticulously collecting and analyzing data on every breakdown of already produced tanks, identifying systemic weaknesses. A permanent emergency commission began working under the chief engineer, investigating any malfunction, finding those responsible, and immediately making corrections to the production process. But the most titanic work was the redesign of the very construction for production. It turned out that the perfect blueprints from Nizhny Tagil meshed poorly with the real capabilities of the ruined plant. For several months, more than 3,000 changes were made to the T-44's documentation. Most were forced, simplifying technology, replacing unavailable materials, correcting errors discovered during assembly. Workers and foremen were forced to work strictly according to new, detailed process sheets, eradicating any improvisation. Simultaneously, pressure was put on suppliers, especially the Mariupol plant, supplying defective armor. The mechanism seemed to start moving, if be it with a creak. But while this exhausting battle for quality raged in the workshops, the high command outside the plant walls had already made its own cold strategic calculation, which sealed the T-44's combat fate. While the battle for quality raged in the half-destroyed Kharkov workshops, at the highest level, a cold, impartial weighing of risks and opportunities was taking place. The Soviet command faced not a technical, but a strategic question. What was more important for victory? A qualitative leap in the form of the T-44 or the unshakable, proven mass of the T-34-85? The answer was dictated by the very logic of total war of attrition. The main argument became numbers that left no room for sentiment. The technological process for producing the T-34-85 had been brought to automation by 1944 at 3 giant plants: Ural-Vagonzavod, the Chelyabinsk-Kirov plant, and plant number 174. Hundreds of thousands of man-hours, operations honed to perfection, supply chains established over decades, all worked as a single well-oiled mechanism. Introducing a fundamentally new, more complex machine into this flawless rhythm would inevitably cause a conveyor breakdown. And this was not a hypothetical risk, but a mathematical certainty. Calculations by the People's Commissariat of the tank industry were merciless. Manufacturing one T-44 required 7,945 man-hours. For the T-34-85, this figure was only 3,210. A difference of 2.5 times meant that in pursuit of one promising but raw tank, the country lost 2.5 ready-for-battle ones. In the conditions of 1944, when the Red Army was conducting continuous offensives on a front thousands of kilometers, such losses in production tempo were tantamount to a strategic mistake. The war had entered a phase where quantity became the decisive factor. Operation Bagration, the liberation of Poland, the battles in East Prussia and Hungary, all these giant operations were meat grinders for equipment. Tank armies suffered losses that needed to be replenished immediately so the offensive wouldn't lose momentum. Halting or even temporarily reducing output at the main plants would have led to a crisis on the most critical fronts. The command saw not an abstract, perfect tank, but specific thousands of tons of steel that had to turn into combat vehicles monthly and go to the front. But even that wasn't the main issue. Beyond production itself existed a colossal, invisible infrastructure tied to the T-34. These were frontline and rear repair depots, where mechanics knew every component by heart. These were warehouses of spare parts, supplying the Army with everything needed to restore damaged equipment in the field. These were training centers where crew training had been honed for years. Replacing the main machine meant collapsing this entire ecosystem, which would paralyze the combat capability of the tank forces for a time. The German experience, with its menagerie of Tigers, Panthers, Ferdinands, and other non-standard equipment, which created a logistical hell, served as a clear example of what not to allow. Therefore, the fate of the T-44 was sealed by sober, pragmatic calculation. It was assigned a different, no less important role. It became not a weapon for today, but an investment in the future. The Kharkov plant, producing tanks in small batches, turned into a giant testing laboratory. Every machine, every identified defect, every change made to the design was part of a grand experiment in creating a next-generation tank. The T-44 was meant not so much to fight, but to teach, to give experience to production workers, designers, and future tankers. Its main mission lay not in battles, but in preparing for the next, already peacetime, but no less tense race. And while it carried out its quiet service, its creators were already thinking about how to turn this complex and painful experience into an indubitable triumph.
Thus, the T-44, conceived as a sharp weapon of breakthrough, was forced to change its role. It became an invisible tank, a secret weapon that never fired in anger. About 1,800 machines that rolled off the Kharkov plant's conveyor belt were distributed to completely different addresses. Their primary place of service became not frontline divisions, but closed training centers, tank schools, and officer improvement courses. Here, on training grounds deep in the rear, future commanders and driver mechanics mastered fundamentally new equipment. They learned to feel the advantages of torsion bar suspension on rough terrain, got used to the peculiarities of the transverse engine and the new, more convenient layout of the fighting compartment. The T-44 became the ideal transitional link for the post-war Army, a bridge from the proven but aging 34 to the equipment of the future. A small number of vehicles were sent to groups of Soviet forces stationed in Germany, Poland, and other Eastern European countries, where they carried out routine garrison duty, serving more as an element of military presence than a real strike force. But a calm, barracks life didn't mean the tank's problems were solved. In the fall of 1945, when the country was already celebrating victory, the military inspectors conducted large-scale control tests of 6 T-44s from the latest September batch. The final report was a cold shower. It stated that despite some improvements, the machine still suffered from a whole host of teething problems. The V-44 engines, working at their limit, quickly overheated and lost power. The gearboxes, despite modifications, still refused to shift cleanly under load. The chassis, especially the torsion bars and road wheels, couldn't withstand long, intensive marches over rough terrain, requiring frequent repairs. The turret traverse mechanisms had play and jammed, reducing firing accuracy. Essentially, the report confirmed the tank remained a raw, unreliable piece of hardware, unfit for real, strenuous combat work. But in the new post-war reality, these chronic ailments were perceived not as a fatal verdict, but as a clearly defined work front. Now there was no deadly rush, no minute-by-minute pressure of deadlines. Every breakdown, every component failure was meticulously documented, analyzed down to the last bolt, and the results were immediately sent back to the Design Bureau and the plant's technological departments. The T-44 turned into a unique, real-world operating test bench. In practice, at the cost of its own constant breakdowns, it revealed the weakest links not only in its own design, but in the entire chain of related production, from the quality of armor steel and casting precision to the assembly of complex units. This painful, routine, but incredibly valuable work of refinement became its main historical mission.
The entire revolutionary tank concept, its heart, bones, and muscles, was run in not in the sterile conditions of a proving ground, but in the dust of training fields, in the mud of autumn maneuvers, in the hands of thousands of cadets and soldiers. Every repaired torsion bar, every modified gear in the transmission, every reinforced suspension component became priceless knowledge. And all this colossal legacy of errors and discoveries, bought at a high price in time and effort, did not vanish. It was carefully collected, systematized, and laid on the desks of the designers led by Alexander Morozov. Their next task was no longer to invent the wheel, but to build a race car based on this invaluable experience. Thus began the path from a talented but troubled firstborn to the true titan that was to inherit the world. All the bitter but invaluable schooling of the T-44 was not in vain. Its fate became not a dead end, but a powerful springboard. Alexander Morozov's design bureau, armed with thousands of breakdown reports, test results, and the bitter experience of production, set about creating not just a new tank, but the perfect machine, incorporating all the lessons learned. Thus, the T-54 was born. This was not just a successor, but the logical, hard-won culmination of the entire journey. The T-54 embodied the maturity of ideas born in the T-44. The transverse engine placement and torsion bar suspension, refined on the Phantom, became the standard, but now they were perfected, their inherent weaknesses eliminated. The main qualitative leap, however, was in armament. Instead of an 85mm gun, the T-54 received the mighty 100mm rifled D-10T gun, capable of penetrating the armor of any potential adversary at distance. The contours of the turret became even more streamlined, turning it into the famous frying pan, and armor protection, thanks to optimal sloping angles, reached a new level while maintaining mass. The result surpassed all expectations. The T-54 and its subsequent deep modernization, the T-55, became the most mass-produced tanks in human history. Their production numbered in the tens of thousands. They served in the armies of more than 50 countries and participated in countless conflicts across the globe. Their main qualities were precisely those the T-44 so lacked: phenomenal reliability, ease of manufacture and repair, and stunning effectiveness. Thus, the T-44 turned out to be not an error or a dead-end branch, but a necessary, albeit painful, stage of evolution. It was a costly but indispensable laboratory where Soviet tank building paid all its dues for new technologies, for breaking old production culture, for the transition to a new era. It never fired at the enemy, but every one of its failures, every breakdown on the proving ground and in the workshop, became bricks in the foundation of post-war triumph. The T-54 and later the T-72, with its global dominance, were the direct heirs of that very secret tank the command did not dare throw into battle. Its main victory was not a battle, but the creation of a school that birthed an entire dynasty of steel masters of the battlefield in the second half of the 20th century.